Everyone has old photographs, from family albums and holiday pictures to random selfies you forgot existed. Most of the time, they are just memories, moments frozen in time. But every now and then, you notice something strange, a picture you swear used to be there, a face you don't recognize, or a memory that nobody else seems to remember. Because photographs are not supposed to change, they are not supposed to disappear, and they definitely are not supposed to come back different. These are 5 missing photo horror stories that felt a little too real. Story 1. The missing selfie. The photo disappeared sometime in October. I know that because we took it after a United match. It was nothing special, just me and 3 friends outside Old Trafford on a cold night after a terrible result. Someone asked for a selfie, and we all squeezed in together. Typical stuff. It was Bilal, Ryan, me, and Ethan. Just 4 idiots standing in front of the stadium. I remember it clearly because Bilal kept complaining that his eyes were closed, and we laughed about it for weeks. The picture became one of those random photos you never think about, until 3 months later. I was scrolling through my camera roll looking for something else when I noticed it was gone. It wasn't hidden or corrupted, it was just completely gone. I frowned, thinking it was weird. Maybe I had deleted it accidentally, so I figured it was no problem. I checked recently deleted and found nothing. I checked Google Photos and found nothing. I checked my cloud backups, but there was absolutely nothing there. It wasn't a big deal, just one picture, but later that evening I messaged our group chat anyway. I typed out, "Anyone still got that Old Trafford selfie?" Bilal replied immediately, asking, "Which one?" I typed back, "Outside the stadium after the Arsenal game." 5 minutes later, Ryan sent it through with a quick message saying, "Found it." I opened the image and completely froze, because there were only 3 people in the photo, me, Bilal, and Ryan. There was no Ethan. At first I laughed, thinking it was the wrong picture, except it wasn't. It was the same night, the same clothes, the same background, and the same miserable expressions. Everything was identical, except Ethan wasn't there. I called Ryan immediately. "Bro, where's Ethan?" I asked. Ryan sounded confused on the other end. "What?" I told him. "In the photo." Ryan laughed and said, "He's not in it." I snapped back. Yes, he was. Then Ryan paused, and his voice changed. "Wait, what are you talking about?" I hung up and called Bilal, but I got the exact same response. He told me, "Bro, Ethan wasn't there that night." I genuinely sat there confused because I remembered him so clearly. He had driven us there. He had been the one complaining about the parking prices, and he had even bought chips for everyone afterwards. I remembered all of it, yet Bilal sounded genuinely confused. He wasn't joking at all. The next day, I went through WhatsApp. There were thousands of messages, photos, and videos, but there was no trace of Ethan. I checked Instagram and Facebook. Nothing. There was no account, no tags, absolutely nothing. That didn't make sense. I had known him since our first year of university, hadn't I? I searched my phone contacts and there was no Ethan, no phone number, and no old texts. I started wondering if I was losing my mind. Until I found something. It was an old video recorded accidentally inside Ryan's car. It was 10 seconds long, mostly dark, and just featured us talking, but clear as day. I heard Ethan's voice. I knew it immediately. The video ended before anyone appeared on screen, but the voice was there as proof. Relieved, I sent it to Bilal. His response came almost instantly, asking, "Who's that?" I called him back. "What do you mean, who's that?" I asked. Bilal hesitated. "The guy talking." I told him, "That is Ethan." There was a long silence, and then Bilal quietly said, "Bro, there's only ever been us 3. I hung up the phone. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I decided to do something stupid. I opened every old group photo from school, birthdays, university, and holidays. Eventually, I found another one from Freshers Week, 6 years earlier. It showed 5 people standing together, except one face had been blurred out. It wasn't done intentionally or pixelated. It was just slightly out of focus. Everyone else looked normal, but only one person looked wrong. I zoomed in and my chest tightened because I recognized the jacket. It was a gray Nike hoodie, the exact same one Ethan wore all the time. With my heart pounding, I checked another photo, then another, and another. Every single time there should have been 4 people, there were only 3. Or one face was blurry, or someone stood just outside the frame like the camera had missed them. But I remembered him laughing, driving, and complaining. I remembered everything, didn't I? The following week I visited my mom. We were going through old family albums when I mentioned it to her. Ever forget somebody completely? I asked. She laughed and said, "Depends who." I told her, "No, seriously." Then I explained what was happening. She smiled and said, "Funny you say that." I asked her what she meant, and she frowned slightly. "When you were little, you always talked about an Ethan." I froze. "What?" My mom shrugged. "An imaginary friend, maybe. He used to sit beside you in photographs." Every single hair on my body stood up. "What?" She laughed softly. "You used to get upset because he never smiled." I couldn't breathe. "Mom, what are you talking about?" She stood up, went upstairs, and returned with an old photo album. Inside sat a picture of me at age 8 during a birthday party, smiling. Beside me, there was an empty space. It wasn't physically empty. There was enough room for someone, like another child should have been standing right there. My mom pointed to it and said, "That's where Ethan used to stand." I stared at it. "What do you mean used to?" She shrugged. "You stopped mentioning him after you turned 10. Then she laughed. "Funny name to remember after all these years." Funny. Nothing about it felt funny. I took the album home and spent hours looking through it. Eventually, I noticed something strange. In every picture with that empty space, I was looking directly toward it. I was smiling at it, talking to it, and even waving, like someone was right there. Then, around 2 in the morning, exhausted and confused, I gave up. As I closed the album, a photograph slipped out that I had never seen before. My stomach dropped because it was the Old Trafford selfie. It was the original with all 4 of us, me, Bilal, Ryan, and Ethan, clear as day. I nearly cried from relief. It was proof, actual proof. Hands shaking, I grabbed my phone, opened the group chat, and sent the picture. I typed out in excitement, "See, told you." Then I waited. Bilal replied first, asking, "Who's that?" Then Ryan typed, "Bro, why did you edit and add somebody into the photo?" I stared at the screen, then slowly looked back down at the physical photograph in my hand, and felt my blood turn cold. Because on the paper where Ethan had just been standing, there was now an empty space, and I was smiling at it. Story 2, Dad's Pictures. My dad passed away in February, and for the first few months I avoided touching anything that belonged to him. It wasn't because I was lazy, it was because every little thing brought memories flooding back. His old coats still hung beside the front door, his mug still sat in the kitchen cupboard, and his study looked exactly the same as it had the day he went into hospital. Eventually, my mom suggested we start sorting through things. Not throwing them away, just organizing them. That was when I found the photo boxes. Dad had always been obsessed with photographs. Holidays, birthdays, weddings, random Sunday afternoons, he documented everything. There were thousands of pictures scattered across dozens of old albums and shoeboxes, some going all the way back to the 70s. I decided to digitize them all so nothing would ever get lost. At first, I actually enjoyed it. Every evening after work, I'd sit in his study with the scanner and slowly work my way through the collection. Sometimes I'd laugh at the ridiculous hairstyles. Sometimes I'd stop and stare at pictures of my grandparents for 10 minutes. It felt nice, like Dad was still around somehow. After about 2 weeks, I noticed something strange. I was working through an album from the late 90s when I realized one of the photographs was missing. There was an empty space in the plastic sleeve where a picture should have been. I frowned, thinking maybe it had fallen out. I searched the floor and checked the other pages, but nothing turned up. It was no big deal, except 2 days later, another photograph disappeared, then another and another. At first I blamed myself. Maybe I had misplaced them, Or maybe they had fallen out somewhere. But eventually I started writing down exactly which photographs were missing. That's when I noticed the pattern. Every missing picture contained the same man. It wasn't Dad, and it wasn't my grandfather. It was someone else entirely. He was a tall man with dark hair. He appeared in the background of some pictures and stood right beside family members and others. Sometimes he smiled directly at the camera. Sometimes he looked distracted, like he'd been caught off guard. And I had absolutely no idea who he was. One evening, while Mom was making tea, I carried an album into the kitchen and pointed at the man. "Who's this?" I asked. Mom glanced over casually. "Who?" "This guy," I said. She frowned. "What guy?" I pointed directly at him. "Right there." She stared at the picture for a few seconds before looking back at me. "There's nobody there." I laughed and said, "Mom, stop messing around." But she looked genuinely confused. "I'm serious," she said. I assumed her eyesight was the problem until I showed my sister. She had exactly the same reaction, telling me there were only 3 people in that picture. "But he's standing right beside Dad," I insisted. "No, he isn't," she replied. I actually felt annoyed. The man was obvious. He wasn't blurry. He wasn't hidden, and he was standing there clear as day. Yet somehow, nobody else could see him. That night, I called Bilal, who had known my family for years. I sent him one of the pictures and waited. A few moments later, he replied with a message saying, "Nice picture." I immediately called him back. "Bro, who's the guy beside my dad?" I asked. Bilal sounded confused. "What guy?" "The tall guy," I told him. Bilal paused for a moment. "There's no one there." I hung up the phone, because suddenly, this wasn't funny anymore. Over the next week, I became obsessed. I scanned every photograph containing the man and stored them in a separate folder on my laptop. There were 23 in total, different years, different places, and different clothes, but always the exact same person. And strangely enough, he seemed to age alongside Dad. In the oldest photographs, he looked young. In the more recent ones, his hair had started turning gray. Whatever explanation existed, it didn't make any sense. Then something worse happened. The folder began shrinking. One night, there were 23 pictures, but the next evening there were 22. I assumed I'd deleted one accidentally, but then another disappeared, and another. Within 2 weeks, only 17 remained. I started backing them up onto memory sticks, cloud storage, my phone, anywhere. It didn't matter. The number just kept dropping. 23 became 17, 17 became 12, and 12 became 8. And every time a picture disappeared, I checked the original albums. The physical copies had vanished too. They weren't damaged or torn out. They were just gone completely, as though they had never existed. Eventually, only one photograph remained. It was taken at my parents' anniversary party about 10 years earlier. Dad stood in the middle, smiling with a glass in his hand, and standing right beside him was the man. His arm rested on Dad's shoulder. He looked almost identical to my father, except slightly older, like an older brother, or maybe something else. I brought the photograph to Mom. "Please tell me you know who this is," I begged. She smiled sadly. "That's your dad." "No, Mom. Dad's here," I said as I pointed. "And this man." She stared at the picture, and then her expression changed slowly, very slowly. The smile disappeared from her face, and for the first time since Dad died, I saw genuine fear on her. She whispered, "Where did you get this?" "What?" I asked. "Where did you get this picture?" "From the albums," I told her. Her hands began shaking. "That picture disappeared years ago." I froze. "What?" She sat down and quietly said, "Your father used to ask me about him." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" She swallowed hard. "He kept showing me photographs and asking the same question." I couldn't breathe. "What question?" Tears filled her eyes, and in a voice I had never heard before, she answered, "He wanted to know why the same man had been following him his entire life." Neither of us slept much that night. Around 2 in the morning, I went downstairs for a drink. As I passed Dad's study, I noticed the scanner light was on. My stomach tightened because I hadn't used it all day. Slowly, I pushed the door open. The scanner sat humming quietly to itself, and resting on the glass was a photograph I had never seen before. It wasn't in any album, and it wasn't in any box. It was just there. Hands shaking, I picked it up. The picture had been taken inside a hospital room. Dad lay asleep in bed, and the date written in the corner showed it had been taken 3 days before he died. And standing beside the bed, smiling directly at the camera, was the same man. But this time, he wasn't looking at Dad. He was looking straight at whoever had taken the photograph.
Story 3. The Holiday Album. My husband Adam and I went to Greece last summer. Nothing expensive, nothing fancy, just 2 weeks away from work and normal life. We both desperately needed it. We'd been married for 4 years, and between our jobs and everything else, we hadn't really had much time together. I was the kind of person who photographed everything, and Adam used to joke that I spent more time taking pictures than actually enjoying things. By the end of the holiday, I had almost 1,000 photos sitting on my phone. Sunsets, meals, beaches, stupid selfies, random cats in the street, everything. Luckily, everything backed up automatically to the cloud, so I never worried about losing anything. About 8 months later, I decided to make a physical photo album for Adam's birthday. I thought it would be nice to have something we could look back on when we were older. One evening after work, I sat down with my laptop and started sorting through all the pictures. That's when I noticed some of them were missing. Not entire days, just random photographs. A picture of Adam outside a restaurant on our first night. A selfie we'd taken near the harbor. A photo of me sitting on the beach laughing after a seagull stole my sandwich. At first I assumed it was some syncing issue. I checked my phone, my laptop, and even my old tablet. Nothing. The pictures were gone. Honestly, it annoyed me more than anything. I spent nearly an hour searching before giving up. Adam walked into the living room and found me muttering to myself. "Problem?" he asked. I explained what was happening, and he laughed. "You've still got 900 other photos. I think you'll survive." I smiled and agreed. He wasn't wrong. 3 days later, the missing photographs came back. I only noticed because I was scrolling through the album again. "There you are," I muttered to myself. But almost immediately, something felt wrong. The dates had changed. One picture was now supposedly taken before we'd even arrived in Greece. Another had somehow moved to the final day of the holiday. I called Adam over and showed him. He shrugged. "Metadata gets messed up sometimes." Then he smiled and added, "Normal people don't memorize dates this much, you know." I rolled my eyes. "I'm serious." He laughed. "I know." For a while, I accepted that explanation. But over the following weeks, little things began bothering me. A beach towel that I clearly remembered being blue had become green. In another picture, 2 drinks sat on the table when I distinctly remembered ordering 3. A white handbag appeared hanging from my shoulder in one image, even though I'd never owned one like that. I actually called my sister about it. She laughed and told me I carried that bag for most of the holiday. "No, I didn't," I insisted. "You definitely did," she replied. Eventually, I started wondering whether my memory was playing tricks on me. People remember things wrong all the time. That had to be it. Then I found the restaurant picture. I remembered the evening perfectly because Adam had food poisoning afterwards and spent half the next day in bed. My parents had joined us for dinner, and we'd spent most of the evening laughing at my dad's terrible jokes. There should have been 4 people around the table. There were 5. Sitting beside my mother was a woman I had never seen before. She looked to be around 50 years old, with dark hair and a gray cardigan. She wasn't blurry. She wasn't hidden in the background. She sat naturally with a menu in her hand, smiling toward the camera as though she'd been with us the entire evening. Immediately, I sent the picture to Mum. A few minutes later she replied, "Lovely photo." I called her straight away. "Mum, who's the woman sitting beside you?" There was a pause. "What woman?" she asked. I laughed nervously. Very funny. But Mum sounded genuinely confused. "Sweetheart, there's nobody there." I thought she was joking until I called Dad. Then my sister. Then Adam. Every single person reacted exactly the same way. None of them could see anyone. And that simply wasn't possible. The woman was obvious. Over the next few days, I became obsessed. I searched through every holiday picture one by one. Eventually, I found 8 photographs containing the same woman. Different days. Different places. Different clothes. But always her. Sometimes she stood across the street. Sometimes she sat on a bench. In one picture she appeared in the reflection of a cafe window. What unsettled me most, though, was that she seemed to be getting closer. In the earliest photograph she was barely visible in the distance. By the final picture, she stood directly behind me, smiling with the same calm expression. One evening, I spread all 8 photographs across the dining room table. Adam walked in and sighed. "You're still doing this?" I pointed at the pictures. "Look at her." He frowned. "Look at who?" I could hear the frustration in my own voice. "The woman." Adam stared at me for a moment. Not annoyed. Not confused. Concerned. Eventually, he sat down beside me and quietly asked, "Hannah, do you think maybe you're scaring yourself?" That hurt, because part of me had already begun wondering the same thing. About a week later, I visited my mum to help her clear out the loft. While sorting through old boxes, we came across several dusty photo albums that had belonged to my grandmother. Most of the photographs were decades old. Family birthdays, Christmas dinners, weddings, things like that. Mum went downstairs to make tea while I stayed behind flipping through them. I smiled at some of the ridiculous hairstyles and old clothes until suddenly, I froze. Standing beside my grandmother in a photograph taken nearly 40 years earlier was the same woman from Greece. At first, I genuinely thought I was imagining it. But there she was. Same dark hair. Same gray cardigan. Same gentle smile. She looked exactly the same age. My hands actually started shaking. I carried the album downstairs and placed it in front of Mum. "Who is this?" I asked. She glanced down casually, but the second she saw the photograph, the color drained from her face. For several seconds she just stared at it. Then she quietly asked, "Where did you find that?" I told her it had been upstairs. Mum slowly sat down in one of the kitchen chairs and kept staring at the picture. "I haven't seen this in years," she whispered. I frowned. "You know her?" Mum swallowed hard. "Not really." I remember feeling frustrated. "Then why are you acting like this?" She looked down at the table and said something that immediately made my stomach tighten. "When your grandmother got Alzheimer's, she became obsessed with her old photographs." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Mum took a deep breath. "She used to show us albums and ask strange questions." "What kind of questions?" My mother looked back at the photograph, and for the first time in my life, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. She wanted to know why the same woman had been appearing in her photographs for her entire life. Neither of us said much after that. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 1 in the morning, I sat alone in the living room and started going through the holiday pictures again. I don't really know what I was looking for. Maybe I was hoping I'd somehow missed something. Maybe I just wanted reassurance that I wasn't losing my mind. Eventually, I reached the final photograph. The one where the woman stood behind me. I stared at it for a few seconds before putting my phone down and rubbing my eyes. I was exhausted. I'd barely slept properly in days, and I remember telling myself I needed to stop. I picked the phone back up again a few moments later, and that's when my stomach dropped. Something had changed. At first I thought I was imagining it. I actually closed the picture and reopened it. Then I zoomed in. The woman wasn't standing behind me anymore. She was sitting beside me. I sat upright immediately. My heart started pounding. I knew exactly where she'd been standing before. I'd spent hours staring at these pictures. I knew every detail by now. But somehow, without me noticing, she'd moved. Her arm rested lightly on my shoulder. And for the first time in any of the photographs, I wasn't looking at the camera. I was looking directly at her. Smiling. Exactly the same way my grandmother had been.
Story 4. Recently deleted. I've always been terrible at managing storage on my phone. Every few months I'd get that annoying message telling me I was running out of space, and every few months I'd spend an evening deleting screenshots, old videos, and duplicate pictures that I didn't need anymore. It had become a routine at that point. One Sunday night, while clearing out hundreds of old memes and football screenshots, I accidentally opened my recently deleted folder. I wasn't really paying attention until I noticed something strange. There were over 300 photographs sitting inside. That immediately confused me because I hadn't deleted that many pictures in months. Most of them were ordinary enough. Screenshots, blurry pictures, receipts, random things I'd forgotten about. But mixed among them were photographs I didn't recognize at all. Not because they were bad or corrupted, but because I genuinely had no memory of taking them. At first, I laughed. I actually assumed I must have been drunk. A couple of the pictures showed empty streets. One showed a shopping trolley abandoned in a car park. Another was just a blurry photograph of the television in my living room. I shrugged and figured maybe I'd taken them accidentally. People do weird things without realizing. Then I checked the timestamps. Every single one had been taken between 2 and 4 in the morning, which made no sense. I lived alone. I worked 9 to 5 and usually fell asleep by midnight. More importantly, I had a smartwatch that tracked my sleep, and according to it, I had been asleep when those pictures were taken. I laughed again, but this time it felt forced. Maybe I'd sleepwalked. Maybe the watch had made a mistake. I almost convinced myself that was the answer until I noticed something else. The pictures stretched back nearly 6 months. Hundreds of photographs. Hundreds. And I couldn't remember taking a single one. The next evening, I showed some of them to my friend Ryan while we watched the Champions League. He scrolled through a few and shrugged. Looks like drunk you as hobbies. I laughed. I don't drink. Ryan grinned. Sleepwalking then. I asked him if he'd ever heard of people taking pictures in their sleep. He shrugged. Bro, people cook meals in their sleep. Taking photos sounds normal compared to that. His answer actually made me feel better. Until I found the house pictures. Most of the photographs had been random, but buried among them were dozens taken inside my own home. The strange thing wasn't what they showed. It was where they had been taken from. One picture showed my kitchen from the hallway. Another showed the living room from behind the sofa. One had been taken from the top of the stairs looking down. They weren't selfies. They weren't accidental pictures. Somebody had deliberately framed them. I remember sitting there with my stomach tightening. Because I never stood in those places. The angle behind the sofa especially bothered me. There was barely enough room to stand there. I spent half an hour trying to recreate it. I couldn't. The wall was too close. The picture shouldn't have been possible. That night, I barely slept. The following morning, I called my sister Sarah and tried explaining everything. She listened patiently before asking the obvious question. Could someone else have your phone? I laughed. Who? She shrugged. An ex? Somebody at work. I told her nobody even knew my password. Sarah went quiet for a moment before saying, You're probably overthinking this. Maybe I was. Except the photographs kept getting stranger. One evening, I found a picture of my front door. Nothing unusual there, until I noticed the chain lock was on. I never used the chain lock. In fact, I hadn't touched it since moving into the house. I got up immediately and checked. The chain lock hung exactly where it always had. Unused. I stood there for several seconds before convincing myself I must have forgotten. But I hadn't forgotten. I knew I hadn't. Over the next week, I became obsessed. I exported every photograph from recently deleted and organized them by date. There were over 400 by then. Most were meaningless, but patterns started appearing. Every picture had been taken during the same hours. Every picture had been deleted within minutes of being taken. And slowly, I noticed something even stranger. The camera seemed to be getting closer to my bedroom. The oldest photographs had been taken outside, then downstairs, then the hallway, then halfway up the stairs, and eventually, my bedroom door closed. I genuinely felt sick, because I had no memory of taking that picture. I called Ryan and asked him to come over. He listened to everything while scrolling through the pictures. At first, he looked amused, but after a while the smile disappeared. This one's weird, he said quietly. I sat up. What? He held out the phone. Who's that? I frowned. What do you mean? He pointed toward the bottom corner of the image. There. I stared. There was nothing. Just the carpet. Ryan looked confused. Bro, somebody's foot. I grabbed the phone from him. There was no foot. Nothing. Ryan frowned. Forget it. I laughed nervously. Very funny. I'm serious, he replied. Neither of us mentioned it again. A few days later, I visited my parents. My mom immediately noticed I looked exhausted, so I told her everything. She spent most of the story smiling sympathetically. You're working too hard, she said. You're stressing yourself out. Dad agreed. People do strange things in their sleep. Eventually, I accepted that maybe they were right, until my mom suddenly frowned. What? I asked. She looked thoughtful. Then she stood up and walked out of the room. A few minutes later, she returned holding an old photo album. Funny you mentioned strange pictures, she said. I frowned. What do you mean? Mom sat beside me and opened the album. Most of the photographs were from when I was a child. Birthdays, holidays, school trips. Then she stopped at one picture taken inside my old bedroom. I smiled. Why would you take pictures of me sleeping? We didn't. I laughed. Very funny. But neither of my parents laughed. Dad quietly said, That photograph appeared in the album one day. I stared at him. What? Mom nodded slowly. We thought one of us had taken it, but neither of us remembered. A cold feeling settled over me. That's impossible. Dad shrugged. We eventually forgot about it. My hands were shaking now. Is that the only one? Neither of them answered. Instead, Mom turned the page. Then another. Then another. My blood ran cold, because every few years, there was another photograph. Me asleep at 12. Me asleep at 16. Me asleep during university. Always the same angle. Always from the doorway. And in every picture, something was slightly different. Sometimes the bedroom. Sometimes the clothes. But the angle never changed. I couldn't breathe. Who took these? Mom just whispered, We don't know. I barely slept that night. Around 3 in the morning, I woke suddenly for no reason. My room was dark and silent. I reached for my phone and saw the screen light up with a notification. Storage full. I frowned. That made no sense. Then another notification appeared. One new photo uploaded. Confused, I opened my gallery. The newest image sat right at the top. My heart nearly stopped. It showed my bedroom, taken from the doorway. I was asleep in bed, and unlike every other photograph I'd found, this one wasn't empty, because standing beside my bed, staring directly at the camera, was me. Story 5, The Empty Frame. For as long as I could remember, There had been a framed photograph hanging in the hallway outside my parents' kitchen. It wasn't anything special, just one of those family pictures people take and then forget about. The frame itself was old and slightly crooked, and every few years Mom would talk about replacing it, but she never did. It had simply become part of the house. If you'd asked me what was in the picture, I probably would have said the same thing I'd always thought. Mom and Dad sitting in the middle, me and my sister standing behind them, and my grandparents at either end. 6 people. A normal family photograph. When I moved out, I didn't really think about it anymore. But one Sunday afternoon, I visited my parents for lunch, and while waiting for Mom to finish cooking, I found myself standing in the hallway staring at the picture. Something felt wrong. Not creepy, not dramatic, just wrong. I couldn't explain why. I stood there for almost 30 seconds trying to figure it out before Mom walked past carrying plates. "What are you doing?" she laughed. I shrugged. "Nothing." Then I pointed toward the picture. "Has that always looked like that?" Mom glanced at it. "What do you mean?" I frowned. "I don't know. It just feels different somehow." Mom smiled. "You've been staring at that thing since you were little. Maybe you're finally bored of it." I laughed and forgot about it. But over the next few weeks, I kept noticing it. Every time I visited, I'd find myself stopping in the hallway and staring at the photograph. Eventually, I mentioned it to my sister. She laughed and said, "You're weird." Then I asked her how many people were in the picture. 6, she replied immediately. I nodded. That's what I thought. Except something still bothered me. One evening, while Mom and Dad were out shopping, I found myself standing in front of the frame again. I don't know why. I just couldn't shake the feeling. Eventually, I took it off the wall and carried it into the living room. That's when I noticed something strange. There was too much space. Everyone stood slightly apart. Not awkwardly. Not enough to look obvious. But enough that it felt like somebody should have been standing between them. I actually laughed at myself. People don't disappear from photographs. I put the frame back and forgot about it. Or at least, I tried to. A few days later, I was visiting my grandmother in her care home. Her memory wasn't what it used to be, but she still had good days. While looking through some old family albums together, I came across another copy of the same picture, and immediately froze. There were only 6 people, exactly the same. Yet somehow, the empty space felt even more obvious. I stared at it for so long that my grandmother noticed. "What?" she asked. I smiled. "Nothing." But she frowned. Then she slowly leaned forward. "Where's the man?" I felt my stomach tighten. "What man?" "The man who took the picture." I laughed nervously. "Nan, he's behind the camera." She shook her head. "No." Then she pointed directly at the photograph. "He was in it." I remember forcing a smile and changing the subject. But I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. That night, I called my sister. I laughed while telling her what Nan had said, expecting her to laugh too. Instead, she went quiet for a moment. "That's weird," she said. I frowned. "Why?" There was another pause. "I don't know." Then she laughed nervously. "Forget it." I asked her what she meant, and she sighed. "Nothing. It's just, when you mentioned the picture the other week, I kept thinking there should have been someone else in it too." I sat up. "What?" She immediately changed her tone. "Forget it. I'm probably just being stupid." But neither of us forgot about it. Over the next week, I became obsessed with that photograph. I visited my parents twice just to stare at it. I searched through old albums looking for different copies. There were 3 in total, all identical. Same 6 people. Same strange gap between everyone. Every time I looked at it, I felt more uncomfortable. Not because anything was changing, but because the empty space seemed impossible to ignore once you'd noticed it. Eventually, I brought one of the copies to Mom. "Do you honestly think this looks normal?" I asked. She frowned. "What do you mean?" I pointed at the space. "Doesn't it feel like someone should be standing there?" Mom laughed. "No." Then she paused. "Actually," I looked up immediately. "Actually what?" Mom frowned slightly. "Nothing." She smiled awkwardly. "Forget I said anything." "No, tell me." But she just shook her head. "That night, Dad called me." "Your mom's upset," he said. I apologized, thinking I'd annoyed her. But Dad sounded strange. "It's not that," he said quietly. "You asking about that picture brought something back." I frowned. "What?" Dad hesitated. "Years ago, your grandfather used to ask about it." My blood ran cold. "What did he say?" Dad was silent for a few moments. Then he quietly answered. He wanted to know why there was a space in the middle. I couldn't sleep after that. The next day, I visited Nan again. She seemed clearer than usual. I didn't mention the photograph at first, but eventually I couldn't help myself. I opened the album and placed it in front of her. "Nan," I asked softly, "what man were you talking about?" She smiled. "The nice man." I swallowed. "What nice man?" "The one who always held the camera." I frowned. "Nan, photographers don't appear in pictures." She looked confused. Then she laughed softly. "No, dear." And she pointed directly at the empty space in the photograph. He wasn't the photographer. I felt cold all over. Then who was he? She looked down at the picture for several seconds before answering. He was family. I just stared at her. Who? But Nan's expression changed. Slowly, the confusion returned to her eyes. She blinked, then smiled. Who what? I never got another answer. 3 weeks later, Nan passed away peacefully in her sleep. After the funeral, Mom and I spent the afternoon sorting through some of her things. Most of it was ordinary. Clothes, books, letters. Eventually, we reached an old wooden box filled with photographs. And right at the bottom sat another copy of the hallway picture. My heart nearly stopped, because this one was different. There were 7 people. Mom gasped. I genuinely thought she was going to drop it. Standing in the middle of the photograph, smiling with one hand resting on my grandfather's shoulder, was a man none of us recognized. He looked to be in his 60s. Gray hair, glasses, kind eyes. He wasn't blurry. He wasn't hidden. He stood there naturally, like he'd always been part of the family. Mom's hands began shaking. Dad showed me this years ago, she whispered. I looked at her. What? Tears filled her eyes. He thought he was losing his mind. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Eventually, I turned the photograph over. Written neatly on the back, in my grandmother's handwriting, were 6 words. Don't forget Uncle David again. I remember looking up at Mom. Who was Uncle David? She just stared at the picture and quietly replied, I don't know. I took the photograph home. I wish I hadn't, because sometime around 2 in the morning, I woke up thirsty and walked downstairs for a drink. As I passed the hallway mirror, I happened to glance toward the old framed photograph hanging on the wall, and I stopped, because the empty space in the middle was gone. Everyone was standing closer together now, as though they had finally made room for someone, or as though someone had finally left. If you ever find an empty space in your old family albums, or notice a shadow in a selfie that shouldn't be there, do yourself a favor and don't look too closely. Some memories are better left forgotten. If these stories turned your blood cold, make sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and leave a comment with your own unexplainable experiences. Sleep well tonight, if you can.